it's 1 o'clock. You're at the Birmingham Museum, and today for our Facebook Live, we're going to be doing what we call our artifact shorts, where we feature an artifact and tell a story about it. This actually, I guess I should call this an artifact medium, because there's a little bit more to say to explain why this artifact is important and how it fits into our plan here at the museum. So I'm standing next to this writing desk that was donated by a descendant of Ziba Swan. Not long ago, about a year ago, we got this item in. And that is when we learned that Dr. Swan, who is buried in Greenwood Cemetery, was actually a physician during the War of 1812. So those are some very interesting things to comment on, and that's part of what I want to do today before I tell you about the actual physical desk itself. So first of all, the War of 1812 is, as Donna, our museum assistant, likes to say, it's the forgotten war. It's between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, and a lot of people don't learn about it in school, or they sort of think of it as a Civil War, they get it mixed up, and that's understandable because the nature of the war was very regional, especially in the Great Lakes. But the War of 1812, which was actually officially ended in 1814, was a significant part of why settlers came to Michigan when they did and how they ended up here in Birmingham. So what we have here in Birmingham, when it was a wilderness and we had numerous settlers coming in 1818 and 1819, is we have this sort of contingent of most of them being veterans of the War of 1812. That tells you a little bit about them, and it tells you a little bit about the community that they would have formed because they had this shared history. The War of 1812 had a lot of military, I guess I would have to say, atrocities associated with it. There was a lot of it that was fought on the water, both in the Great Lakes and also in the ocean. So there's a huge amount that was going on in terms of the Navy. But in the infantry, which is where Dr. Swan was assigned, there was a kind of a mixture of guerrilla warfare and the old style stand up in a line and shoot at each other. Both were happening. When it came to Dr. Swan's role as an infantry surgeon, we've learned a few things about what that means. And that's what I want to just give you some updates on before we talk about the artifact. Because the artifact, according to the family, was used by Dr. Swan while he served as a surgeon during the war. That means that this artifact may connect directly to the war and his participation in it. But what did a doctor during the War of 1812 face? Well, here's some statistics to share with you. On the ground in the infantry, a physician and a physician's mace, those two men, would be assigned usually to about 1,000 men under their care. Of those 1,000 men, approximately 60% would need medical care during the time that they were serving. So now we're talking about possibly 600 men that Dr. Swan and his surgeon assistant would be dealing with in the field. They would have 25% of that 600 men would be wounded in battle. Most of those wounds, if they survived, would be from musket balls kind of tearing apart their extremities. Cannonball fire too. Some of it was hand-to-hand combat with very, very sharp swords, and so you can imagine the kind of injuries that resulted from those things, and the challenge when people didn't know what infection was, they didn't know how to prevent bacterial infections. Men were dying left and right, even if they were treated, appropriately. So 25% of them would have wounds from battle, but the other 75%, or like I said, we're talking about 450 men under his care, would have disease. And that was the very most deadly part of serving in the War of 1812. It was not dying on the battlefield. It was getting disease. Typhus, smallpox was present, although, interestingly, a smallpox vaccine had just come out. And in the beginning of the War of 1812, soldiers were inoculated using the vaccine. It was the Jenner vaccine, but smallpox was still circulating around them by camp followers and so forth. Other diseases included dysentery, and these all occurred because there was no clear sense that you shouldn't put a latrine next to your source of fresh drinking water. So that's a little bit of the scene you get. So Ziba Swan, here he is, he's in the field. He was, his rank was infantry brigadier, which is just above a colonel and just below a
major general.
That's pretty high up. That wasn't unusual for surgeons. They were usually educated men who would come in and would be given an officer status. So coming back to the desk, in the field, in a medical unit, you would be at the back of the battle. You would not necessarily be picking up and running around with the normal battle officers. So a physician needed to be more in a stable position. And that may explain this curiosity about this desk. There is such a thing as a campaign desk. Those are desks that were designed to be folded up and scooped up and taken away very quickly. And that's what most officers would have used because they would be moving from place to place quite a lot. This is not technically a campaign desk. So let me tell you a little about what we do have here. You decide for yourself whether you think this could have been at the scene of the battle or not. This is a two-part desk. It has a base, which is the writing portion, and then it has a hutch, which is the area that, you know, would have had, if it were in your home, it would have had writing instruments and letters and things of that nature, paper. And these are two separate units. So the base of the desk lifted up and could be carried like you would carry a table. A campaign desk would often actually have folding, some mechanisms that where the legs would actually fold up or detach completely. This doesn't have that. So this is like a standard writing desk that you would find anywhere. And then the hutch, which fits on the top, consists of very simple interior. You've got shelves, you've got little cubby holes. These appear to be original. We don't know that for sure. And then all these slots. Now, there were originally locks on the top as well as on the drawer of the desk. Those have long since been removed or damaged, probably because they were locked and someone needed to get into the desk or, you know, wanted to get into it. But you can picture, I believe, that if you're a physician at the front and you have this in your tent, this is where you're going to keep your tonics and things that you're providing to all of these sick soldiers. Let me tell you a little bit about the state of medical technology at the time. Most physicians were still encumbered by the idea of bleeding patients to make them better and purging. So if you're suffering typhus, the last thing you need is more purging, but that would be often what would occur. However, there were some advances in medical understanding based on scientific observation that gradually trickled down to physicians, which included, besides just good common sense, included some understanding that there were some kind of a, they called it, I think, animalistic. They perceived that there was some kind of tiny animal maybe that had something to do with disease. Not far off from the theory of microbes, but not quite there either. So Ziba Swan would have had herbs at his dispensary. He would have had Peruvian bark, which had been identified as a effective use in fever. That is actually the source of quinine, and that was later found to be very helpful in malaria. So that was used extensively. And then, as I said, good common sense. Most physicians recognize that cleanliness reduced infection, that keeping soldiers far apart reduced infection, and that survival was going to be better if you kept your saws and blades clean after amputations, which were very common. So Ziba Swan came here to Birmingham, and this desk came with him, we're told, and was in the family until just about a year ago when it came to us. So I guess, what do you think? Do you think this could have been an actual desk that he took to the front with him? It's kind of an open question, but I will remind you that at the time, even officers did not have an allowance for materials. They had to bring their own things. Even doctors had to supply their own herbs and medications to their patients. So I don't know. I think if it were me, I'd want something like this around, so I'd have a place to lock up my stuff and a place to record, what I needed to about the soldiers that I was treating. Ziba Swan lived until 1847. He is buried in Greenwood Cemetery. He and his wife Elizabeth had 4 children, and they were born actually before they migrated here. But one of his daughters, who was known as Betsy, married a man who also migrated here and is well known in the area. His name was Sidney Dole. So she and her husband came when her father and mother came here, and other members of the family were here for a time as well. So we see this often where families came together to the New World, to the wilderness. And Ziba Swan, as I said, is buried in the cemetery, and our Greenwood Cemetery is a great place to visit. And whether you want to see our veterans who will be identified there next week by the DAR with little flags, I encourage you to stop through. Or give us a call if you have a question, or if you know of somebody at Greenwood that you think ought to be recognized that currently is not. So for today, I'm going to close with a reminder that next week, Veterans Day will take place, I think, on Wednesday. So on Thursday, Donna is going to be talking about a special veteran and a collection here. She's going to do another artifact short, or maybe it'll be a medium, and we'll kind of pick up that veterans theme. Thanks for joining us. See you next week.